Sergeant Dale Pruitt snatched the rifle out of Elena's hands before she even cleared the truck gate. He held it up like evidence at a crime scene, turning it slowly so every Marine in the yard could get a good look. The barrel was worn, the stock was cracked along the grip. The scope mount had been repaired with what looked like electrical tape and a prayer. He laughed so hard, his shoulders shook, and the men around him followed like it was the funniest thing they had seen in 6 months of desert deployment. "This thing belonged in a museum," Pruitt announced to the yard. "Lady, where did you dig this up? A garage sale?" More laughter. Someone in the back whistled. Another voice called out that she would be better off throwing rocks. Elena did not answer him. She reached out, calmly took the rifle back from his hands and slung it over her shoulder like she was picking up a sleeping child. She looked at Pruitt the way a surgeon looks at a nervous intern, patient unimpressed, already done with the conversation. Nobody caught that look except Captain Mark Reynolds, and it was the first thing that told him this woman was going to change everything. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time. Hit that button, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let us get into it. Part 1. The joke that started it all. The convoy had come in from the southwest quarter, 3 trucks running under a heat shimmer, so thick the vehicles looked like they were melting into the road. FOB Ravenfall had been seeing supply runs every few days, but this one was different. Nobody had announced it. No manifest had been cleared through Captain Reynolds' desk. The gate guards waved the trucks through on the basis of a temporary access code that checked out in the system but had no corresponding paperwork, which meant someone very far up the chain had authorized this delivery and had not bothered to tell anyone at Ravenfall what was actually inside. When the last truck dropped its tailgate, the Marines who gathered around expected crates. They expected ammunition, maybe water, filtration equipment, perhaps a new radio array to replace the one that had been frying out in the heat. What stepped down instead was a woman. She was not in full tactical gear. She wore a worn field jacket over a base layer, canvas trousers with deep cargo pockets and a hood that had a long tear along the left seam. She carried a pack that looked older than some of the Marines watching her. And across her back, slung with a single-point brace over her right shoulder, was a rifle that stopped conversation before it even started. Sergeant Dale Pruitt was the first one to say it out loud. Is that thing bolt action? He was a big man, Pruitt. 6'2", built through the chest like he had been assembled rather than born with a gall that looked like it could crack walnut shells and a personality to match. He had been at Ravenfall for 4 months and had appointed himself the unofficial social authority of the base, the man who decided what was funny, what was weak, and what deserved to be commented on loudly enough for everyone to hear. He walked up to Elena before she had taken 3 steps inside the gate. He looked her up and down in the way some men do when they have already decided what they are seeing and do not need any additional information. "You lost, sweetheart." Elena did not stop walking. She moved past him at the same steady pace, her eyes scanning the interior of the base with the kind of calm, methodical focus that had nothing to do with tourism. She was reading the place, counting exits, measuring angles, taking in the position of every structure in relation to the ridgeline behind the northern wall. Pruitt turned to follow her progress and kept talking because silence made him uncomfortable. "Hey, I am talking to you. You with the traveling circus rifle." That got the laugh he was looking for. The half-dozen Marines in the yard started grinning. A corporal named Briggs, who was Pruitt's shadow and had been for the entire deployment, cupped his hands around his mouth and said, "She is going to use that thing as a walking stick by Friday." More laughter. Elena stopped walking, not because of Pruitt, not because of Briggs. She stopped because she had finished her initial scan of the base perimeter and had found what she was looking for, a decommissioned observation tower on the northern wall, the one that had been condemned after a structural assessment 6 weeks ago and subsequently ignored by everyone. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, making calculations behind her eyes that nobody watching her could have decoded, and then she continued toward the command building. Pruitt grabbed the rifle. He did it fast, the way a bully moves before anyone can object. A quick hand over her shoulder fingers, closing on the barrel, pulling it free from her grip with a sharp yank. He held it up above his head and turned it so the whole yard could see. The tape on the scope mount caught the desert sun. The worn finish on the receiver looked almost silver. "Look at this," he said. "Look at this thing. This is what they are sending us now. Some woman with a museum piece and a torn jacket. He shook his head with theatrical disappointment. This rifle is junk, straight up junk. I wouldn't use this to prop open a door. The yard erupted. Elena turned around. She walked back to Pruitt at the same measured pace she used for everything stopped in front of him and held out her hand. Not aggressively, not emotionally. She simply held out her hand with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew the outcome of the next 5 seconds. Pruitt hesitated for just a moment because something in that hand, in the stillness of it, in the absolute absence of anxiety, made a small alarm go off somewhere in the back of his nervous system. He ignored it because men like Pruitt had learned to suppress those alarms in favor of the performance. He placed the rifle back in her hand with a dramatic little bow, still grinning. Elena slung it back over her shoulder, looked at Pruitt once and walked away. She did not look angry. She did not look humiliated. She looked the way a chess player looks after an opponent makes a move that they expected 12 turns ago. Captain Mark Reynolds had watched all of it from the doorway of the command building. He was 38 years old 2 tours before this one, and he had developed over the course of those years a very specific sensitivity to anomaly. Not the kind of anomaly that set off alarms, the kind that simply did not fit the pattern of everything around it. Elena Cross did not fit any pattern he recognized, and that made him pay attention the way a navigator pays attention to a landmark that is not on any map. He stepped back inside and pulled up the access terminal. Her name was in the system. Elena Cross. The paperwork that had authorized her arrival was signed at a level 3 grades above Reynolds' commanding officer, which meant it had come from a place in the chain where Reynolds did not have eyes. Her personnel file had a case number, a date of original commission, and then a series of redacted blocks that covered the next 7 years of her service record. Medical history restricted, operational assignments restricted, performance evaluations restricted, awards and commendations restricted. The only thing that was not restricted was her listed specialty. 3 words, long-range precision engagement. Reynolds closed the terminal and went looking for her. He found her at the base of the condemned tower. She was not looking at it anymore. She was already halfway up the external access ladder, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that made the ascent look effortless. Her pack was still on her back. The rifle was slung. Her hands moved from rung to rung without hesitation. "That tower is condemned," Reynolds called up to her. She did not stop climbing. "The structural assessment flagged 2 of the 4 support columns," he continued. "We have standing orders not to use it." She reached the top platform, stepped over the railing, and looked down at him. "How old is the assessment?" Reynolds paused. 6 weeks. "And has anything in those 6 weeks caused additional structural stress?" He thought about it. Nothing had. The base had been quiet. No ordnance had detonated anywhere near the tower. No heavy vehicles had come within 50 meters of the base of it. Elena looked out from the platform toward the ridgeline. She stood very still. "The columns are fine," she said. "The assessment flagged surface corrosion. That is not the same thing as structural failure." Reynolds stared up at her. "How do you know that from up there?" She looked Babushane at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. "I do not know it from up there. I knew it before I climbed." Then she turned back to the ridgeline and stopped talking. Reynolds stood at the base of the ladder for a long moment. Then he went back to the command building and started making phone calls, trying to find someone who would tell him who this woman actually was and why she had been sent to his base without explanation. Nobody told him anything. By mid-afternoon, word had spread through Phobe Ravenfall the way all gossip spread through small forward operating bases, fast, distorted, and with a level of embellishment that multiplied with every retelling. The version that Pruitt was circulating by dinner had Elena as a disgraced officer who had washed out of 2 previous assignments and been sent to Ravenfall as a kind of last resort, a desk jockey with a fancy rifle that she probably could not shoot straight. The version that Briggs was telling had her as a political appointment, someone's niece or daughter sent into theater to check a box and given a classified-looking file to make the whole thing seem legitimate. Neither of them had any evidence for any of it, but they also had not seen what Reynolds had seen that afternoon. They had not watched her move through the base with the eyes of someone who was not looking at what was in front of her, but at what was underneath it, at the architecture of threat and advantage that most people never thought to notice. They had not seen her hands on that rifle when Pruitt grabbed it. The way there was absolutely no flinch in her body, no protective reflex, no personal attachment, just the calm of someone who had long ago learned not to love objects because objects could be taken, and loving things that could be taken was a liability she had stopped carrying. Reynolds sat in his office at dusk and went through the fragments of her file one more time. There was a service photograph taken at what appeared to be a standard commission intake. Elena Cross was 24 in the photograph. Dark hair pulled back tight. Eyes that looked directly at the camera with the same neutral precision they had used on him through the tower railing. Even at 24, there was something behind those eyes that was not youth. Something that had already seen enough to understand what most people spent their entire careers trying to learn. He found a partial after-action report attached to a field exercise from 9 years ago. Most of it was redacted, but one sentence in the summary survived the classification filter. It read, "Operator demonstrated engagement accuracy at distances exceeding standard doctrine parameters under conditions that were not simulated." Reynolds read that sentence 4 times. He was still thinking about it when the radio crackled at 2200 hours. The night watch corporal's voice had the specific quality of someone trying to stay calm over a channel that others might be monitoring. "Captain, we have movement on the North Ridge. Multiple contacts. Possible scout element." Reynolds was on his feet before the sentence was finished. He crossed the command building in 6 strides and pulled up the thermal imaging feed from the ridge-facing sensors. The display showed heat signatures moving along the rocky spine of the ridge above the northern wall, low careful spread out in the spacing of professionals rather than the clustering of amateurs. 3 figures, maybe 4, moving at a pace that suggested surveillance rather than assault. He reached for the handset to authorize a response team. He never used it. The sound arrived first. A single crack, clean and hard-edged, not the flat pop of close-range fire, but the sharp report of something that had traveled a great distance at very high velocity. It came from the direction of the condemned tower. One of the thermal signatures on the ridge went still. Reynolds froze. The second shot came 11 seconds later. The same clean, hard report. Another signature went still. Then silence. The remaining signatures on the ridge stopped moving. Reynolds watched the display as they held position for 4 seconds, 5, 6, and then they were gone. Retreating in the broken panic movement of people who had just watched 2 of their team disappear without warning, without sound, without any indication of where the threat was coming from. Reynolds grabbed his radio. "All units stand by. North Ridge report." The night watch corporal came back, and his voice was no longer calm. "Captain, I am looking at the tower. There is someone up there. I can see there is a muzzle flash residue on the north side. I can see it on the thermal." Reynolds was already out the door. He crossed the base at a jog, reached the tower, looked up. Elena was still in position on the platform, prone across the railing, the old rifle extended in front of her. She was scanning the ridge with steady, methodical sweeps, checking for additional contacts with the same patience she had used that afternoon when she was watching the base. She was not looking down at him. She already knew he was there. 2 contacts eliminated, she said without turning. A third retreated west, likely a 3-man scout element. The 4th signature I tracked was a false positive thermal reflection off a boulder formation. Reynolds stood at the base of the tower with his mouth not quite closed. "You fired from up there, in the dark, at a mile." 840 meters, she said. The second shot was closer, 790. They had moved position after the first engagement. "They moved position and you still," he stopped himself, recalculated. "That was your second shot, after they moved." She did not answer. She was still scanning. Reynolds put one hand on the ladder. He stood there for a moment, feeling the specific sensation of a man who has been operating with a set of assumptions about the world and has just had all of them removed without warning. He had seen good shooters. He had seen very good shooters. He had never seen anyone eliminate a moving target at close to 800 meters in darkness with a rifle that Sergeant Dale Pruitt had described publicly as suitable for a museum. "That rifle," he said. Elena turned her head slightly. For the first time, there was something almost human in her expression. Not amusement exactly, something quieter than that. "The rifle," she said, "is not the issue." She went back to scanning. Reynolds climbed back down the ladder, walked back toward the command building, and paused in the middle of the yard. The base was quiet. The Marines on duty at the perimeter were still at their posts, some of them aware that something had happened, none of them aware of what. In the bunkhouse, Pruitt was asleep, and in the morning he would hear the story of the shots from the tower. And he would not, Reynolds knew, immediately connect it to the woman he had called sweetheart and made the centerpiece of his yard entertainment that afternoon. Reynolds made a note in his operational log. He wrote it in the careful, factual language of someone who was not yet ready to put his full interpretation into words. He wrote 2 confirmed eliminations North Ridge, approximately 2,200 hours. Unconventional engagement, distance, conditions, outcomes confirmed, shooter E cross. He looked at that last line for a long moment. Then he added 3 words at the end. He would not show those 3 words to anyone because they were not operational language. They were the honest assessment of a man who had been in the field long enough to recognize something he had never encountered before. He wrote she already knew. The morning brought heat and noise and the specific friction of a forward base coming awake under desert sun. Reynolds was at his desk by 05:30, working through communications that had come in overnight, when Pruitt appeared in his doorway looking rumpled and skeptical. Word had gotten around about the shots. The base had been buzzing since before breakfast, but the specific details had gotten muddled in the retelling. And Pruitt was operating on the version where some kind of automated sensor system had triggered a perimeter response. I heard there was contact on the ridge, Pruitt said. That's right. Scouts. 3-man element, 2 eliminated, 1 withdrew. Pruitt nodded, arms crossed, standing in the doorway with the posture of a man who is about to say something that he thinks is insightful. Our boys handle it. Reynolds looked at him. No. Pruitt waited. It was handled from the tower, Reynolds said. A beat of silence. The condemned tower. Yes. Another beat. Pruitt's expression was working through something. Who was in the tower? Reynolds turned back to his terminal. Cross. He could hear the precise moment that Pruitt's understanding arrived, a small shift in the quality of the silence, a change in the air pressure of the room that had nothing to do with the ventilation system. He did not look up. He did not want to see the expression on Pruitt's face. He was not interested in witnessing the specific mechanics of a man who has been comprehensively wrong about something confronting that wrongness for the first time. The woman, Pruitt said. Yes. With the old rifle. That's the one. Pruitt said nothing else. Reynolds heard him leave. He gave it until noon before he anticipated that the betting pool on how fast Elena would fail, which Briggs had organized with the enthusiasm of a man running a carnival game, would have quietly dissolved. He was off by 2 hours. It dissolved by 09:45. By midday, something had shifted in the texture of the base. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of shift that anyone would have been able to point to and describe in specific terms. But Elena moved through the base differently. Now, or rather, the base moved around her differently. The wide berth that had been about mockery in the morning had become something else by the afternoon. Something that looked from a distance more like respect, though nobody was calling it that yet because that would have required someone to acknowledge publicly that they had been wrong, and that was a process that took longer than one morning. Elena did not appear to notice. She had returned to the tower as soon as the sun was high enough to give her clear sight lines, and she had been up there for 3 hours still watching the ridge with the patience of something geological. She had eaten nothing that Reynolds had seen. She had spoken to no one except him. He climbed the ladder at 1,400 hours with 2 canteens and a field ration pack. She accepted the water, not the ration pack. You need to eat, he said. I eat when I am not working. And when is that? She considered the ridge for a moment. When there is nothing on it. Reynolds looked out at the empty ridge line, then back at her. I have been trying to pull your full file. I keep hitting restriction walls. She said nothing. I am not asking for operational details, he said. I am asking because you are on my base, and I am responsible for the people on my base, including you, and it is very hard to be responsible for someone when I cannot read their file. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, My file has walls for a reason. I understand that. I am asking you not the file. Another silence. The kind that Reynolds was beginning to recognize as her version of consideration, not hostility, not evasion, but the specific processing of someone who had learned very carefully what to say and what to keep and was running the calculation on which category this fell into. You will find out what you need to know, she said finally, when you need to know it. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have right now. Reynolds capped one of the canteens. He looked at her for a moment at the absolute stillness of her in position, the way she breathed slowly and regularly, the way her eyes stayed soft at the scope even when she was clearly not sighting on anything specific. She was resting in the position the way other people rested in chairs. It was home to her, the most natural place in her body. The men are going to have questions, he said. Let them. They are going to want to know. They are going to want a story, she said. Something that explains what happened on the ridge in terms that fit what they already believe about the world. I cannot give them that story, so let them make up their own. She adjusted the cant of the scope by a fraction. They will get it wrong, that is fine. Reynolds looked at her a moment longer. Then he said, "What do you want from this posting?" She turned her head and looked at him directly for the first time since he had climbed the ladder. Her eyes were the specific gray-green of old military glass, neutral on the surface, but with something moving underneath that he could not quite categorize. "High ground," she said, "and a sector worth watching." Then she went back to the scope. Reynolds climbed down the ladder, walked back across the base, and sat at his desk for a long time without opening any files. He thought about the service photograph, about the 7 years of redacted blocks, about the sentence from the field exercise summary operator demonstrated engagement accuracy at distances exceeding standard doctrine parameters under conditions that were not simulated. He thought about what kind of a career produced a file that needed that many walls. What kind of operations? What kind of outcomes? What kind of cost? He thought about the way she had taken the rifle back from Pruitt's hands. The absence of flinch. The absence of anger. The absolute stillness of someone who had been through enough that mockery from a sergeant in a dusty yard was not even registered as a genuine event. Background noise. A bird flying past. Nothing. Whatever had made Elena cross, it had made her at enormous expense. He pulled up the base perimeter map and started rethinking the defensive positions for the northern approach. He had been working with the existing layout for 4 months, operating on the assumption that the condemned tower was a liability rather than an asset. He started drawing new lines on the map, repositioning sectors of fire, recalculating coverage angles from the tower platform. He worked for 2 hours. When Pruitt appeared in the doorway again at 1600 hours, Reynolds had the map up on the display and did not look away from it. "Captain?" Pruitt's voice had lost its usual performance. He was speaking in a register that Reynolds associated with men who were working through something. "The guys have some questions." "About Cross?" "Yes, sir." Reynolds let the silence sit for a moment. "What kind of questions?" "Mostly about," Pruitt paused, assembled words, "about what she actually is, where she comes from, what her deal is." Reynolds looked at the map. "What she is," he said, "is the person who eliminated 2 scouts off the North Ridge last night at close to 800 meters with a rifle you called junk in front of the entire base." He turned to Pruitt. "Beyond that, I cannot tell you anything because I do not know anything beyond that. Her file is above my clearance level." Pruitt absorbed this. He was doing the thing Reynolds had observed in other men confronting a revised reality, the physical processing of it, the adjustment of posture, the reconfiguration of facial expression to accommodate something that did not fit the previous map. "She is very good," Pruitt said finally. "Not a question." "She is something I do not have a word for," Reynolds said, "and I have been doing this for 16 years. Pruitt nodded once. He started to leave, then he stopped in the doorway and said without turning around, "I should not have grabbed the rifle." Reynolds looked at him. "No, you should not have." Another nod, then Pruitt was gone. Reynolds turned back to the map. He looked at the tower position. He had recalculated the firing angles from the platform 3 different ways, and each time the results came back the same. From that position, with clear sight lines on the north and northeast approaches, with the right operator behind the right equipment, the tower could cover approaches that the rest of the base perimeter could not. It was not condemned. It was the most important position on the base, and she had seen that within 45 seconds of stepping through the gate. He looked at the map a moment longer. Then he reached for his radio and began rethinking every assumption he had built over the past 4 months, starting with the ones about what kind of threat FOB Ravenfall was actually facing and what kind of asset had just stepped out of the last truck in a beat-up convoy and made everyone laugh. The ridge was quiet through the rest of the day, But Reynolds had been doing this long enough to understand that quiet was not safety. Quiet was the adjustment period. The time when whatever was out there recalibrated after losing two people it had not expected to lose to a shooter it had not known was there firing from a position they had not known was occupied. The quiet meant they were regrouping, and he was beginning to understand with the particular clarity of someone who has just watched something operate that far outside the expected range, that when they came back, they were going to come back with a very different estimate of what they were dealing with. He hoped he was wrong. He was not wrong. The betting pool was gone by morning, but the questions it left behind were louder than any wager Briggs had ever organized. By 0600 FOB Ravenfall was running on two kinds of fuel, diesel and speculation. Every Marine who had been in the yard when Pruitt grabbed that rifle was now quietly recalibrating, doing the private arithmetic of a person who has been publicly wrong and is trying to figure out how wrong exactly and whether anyone noticed the specific degree of it. Pruitt noticed all of them noticing. He said nothing. He ate his breakfast in silence, which for Dale Pruitt was so unusual that Briggs checked his temperature. Elena was already in the tower. Reynolds confirmed it at 0545 when he crossed the yard with his second coffee and looked north out of habit. She was up there in the gray pre-dawn light in position scanning. She had been up there all night or had returned before first light. He could not tell which, and when he climbed the ladder to check, she did not volunteer the information. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some. Up here?" She did not answer that one. He looked at the ridge. The early light was coming in flat and pale across the rock formations, throwing long shadows behind every outcropping. It was the kind of light that made distances deceptive, that made a man at 600 meters look like he was at 300. She was scanning it in slow, even sweeps, the way a lighthouse beam moves, not searching for something specific, but covering the geometry of the space so completely that nothing could exist in it without being found. "Intel came in overnight," Reynolds said. "Regional Command is tracking a mobile unit operating in the corridor south of us. Estimated strength 40 to 60 personnel. Vehicle-mounted weapons. They have been hitting smaller installations along the supply route." She did not stop scanning. "How long before they reach this sector?" "Best estimated is 72 hours, maybe less. The ridge will give them observation first. They will put spotters up before they commit a ground element." "I know. They already had spotters up. Last night was reconnaissance, not a probe." Reynolds had reached the same conclusion, but had not wanted to say it out loud yet, because saying it out loud made it committed reality rather than operational hypothesis. "I know that too." So they know this base exists. They know the layout from the ridge. What they do not know yet is what happened to their two scouts. "We pulled the bodies before first light. No sign left on the ridge." For the first time that morning, she shifted her weight slightly. Not much, just enough to suggest that this piece of information mattered. "Good. Then they are not sure. They will send another scout element to find out what happened to the first one." Reynolds wrapped both hands around his coffee. "And when they do," she looked through the scope, "they will find out." He climbed back down the ladder, went to the command building, and began drafting a request to Regional Command for additional defensive assets. He did not expect to get them. FOB Ravenfall was not a high-priority installation. It was a logistics waypoint, a refueling position, a place that existed on maps but rarely in conversations at the command level. The kind of base that received condemned towers and no replacement parts, and apparently one woman with a classified file and a rifle that everyone had laughed at. He sent the request anyway. Then he started working through the defensive plan he had been building the night before, the one that repositioned the entire northern coverage architecture around the tower. At 0800, Corporal Briggs knocked on his doorframe. "Sir, the guys want to know if she is staying." Reynolds did not look up. "She is assigned here, so yes." "For how long?" "Her orders do not specify a duration." Briggs shifted his weight from foot to foot. He was 23, built like a distance runner, and had the kind of face that showed every thought as it arrived. Right now, the thought arriving was one he was clearly not sure how to word. "The thing is, sir, some of the guys they want to know what she actually is. Like what her MOS is, what she was doing before this. Because the shots last night..." He stopped. Reynolds looked up. "The shots last night, what?" Briggs exhaled. They were not normal shots, sir. I talked to the watch corporal this morning. He said the second shot came 11 seconds after the first. 11. In the dark, at a moving target. That is not a normal skill set. No, Reynolds agreed, it is not. So what is she? Reynolds looked at him for a moment. Corporal, if I told you I do not know, and that my clearance is not high enough to find out, and that whoever sent her here did not feel the need to brief me on her background, would that answer your question? Briggs thought about it. Not really, sir. No, but it is what I have. Reynolds went back to his papers. Tell the men to focus on their own jobs. Cross will focus on hers. Briggs started to leave. And Briggs, the corporal stopped. The betting pool. It is done. A pause. Yes, sir, it has been done since about 06:30. Reynolds nodded. Good. The morning passed in the specific rhythm of a forward base that is not actively under fire but knows it is going to be the tightening of routines, the double-checking of equipment, the conversations between men that are about logistics on the surface but are really about something quieter and harder to name. Reynolds watched it from his doorway. He had seen this particular frequency before. The base knew something was coming. Not from a briefing, not from an official communication, but from the animal part of the brain that processes ambient information and produces results before the conscious mind catches up. Elena came down from the tower at 09:30 for the first time since Reynolds had climbed up at 05:45. She crossed the yard with the same deliberate economy of movement she used for everything, went to the water station, filled one canteen, and was about to head back when Pruitt stepped into her path. Not aggressively. That was the first thing Reynolds noticed watching from across the yard. Pruitt was not blocking her. He stepped into her path and then immediately created space, both hands visible, which for a man of Pruitt's physical confidence was something close to a gesture of surrender. Cross, Pruitt said. She stopped. She looked at him with the neutral attention she gave everything, not warm, not cold, just present. I wanted to, he stopped, tried again. Last night on the ridge, 2 shots. Yes. I heard the report from the watch corporal. She waited. Pruitt was doing the thing that hard men do when they have to say something that costs them the jaw, working slightly, the shoulders carrying a tension that had nothing to do with threat. I should not have grabbed your rifle, he said. What I said about it, I was wrong. She looked at him for a moment. Her expression did not change, but something in the quality of her attention shifted. She was looking at him the way she looked at the ridge, with genuine focus rather than ambient surveillance. It is a good rifle, she said. Pruitt blinked. I know what it looked like. The faintest compression at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but in the same family. It is supposed to look like that. Pruitt stared at her. You mean, a rifle that looks like junk gets underestimated? She held his gaze. Same as its owner. She filled her canteen and walked back to the tower. Pruitt stood in the middle of the yard for a solid 10 seconds after she left, and Reynolds could see on his face the exact moment that all of yesterday's performance collapsed, and something honest replaced it. It was not a comfortable expression, but it was a real one. By noon, the base had reorganized itself around Elena in the way that groups of people unconsciously reorganize around the gravitational anomaly. Not talking to her, she did not invite conversation and spent most of her time in the tower, but orienting toward her. The men on perimeter duty started checking the tower position before they checked anything else, the way sailors check the horizon before checking their instruments. Reynolds noted it. He noted everything. At 1300 hours, he called a defensive briefing with his squad leaders, Pruitt among them, and walked them through the revised coverage plan. When he got to the tower, Pruitt asked the question Reynolds had been expecting. We are treating the tower as a primary fire position. Yes. The structural assessment has been revised based on new information, Reynolds said, which was accurate in the sense that the new information was Elena saying the columns were fine, and then demonstrating a precision of judgment that made him inclined to trust her, read on structural integrity as much as everything else. The squad leaders looked at the map. They looked at the angles. They understood immediately what the tower gave them, the coverage it created on the northern approach, the overlapping fields of fire, the positions it denied to anyone trying to advance through the canyon. Sergeant First Class Okafor, who led 2nd Squad and had been quietly observing Elena since the previous night without saying anything to anyone about it, spoke up. What is her effective range with that platform? Reynolds considered the answer. Last night's engagements were at 790 and 840 meters. The room went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when numbers arrive that don't fit the existing scale. Okafor said slowly, in the dark. Yes, another silence. What is her effective range in daylight? Okafor asked. Reynolds looked at the map. I do not know. I have not asked her, and her file does not say. The implications settled over the room. If she was doing 780-40 in darkness in daylight on a stable platform with full visibility, the math was something none of them had an immediate framework for. Briggs, who had apparently decided that the appropriate response to everything Elena related was to ask the next logical question, said quietly, is she going to be enough if they come with 40 or 60 personnel? Nobody answered him immediately. Reynolds looked at the map. He thought about the way she had read the base in 45 seconds, the way she had placed herself in the only position that gave complete coverage of the northern approach before anyone had told her the northern approach was the threat vector. The way she had known about the scouts before they were confirmed, had fired in the dark with precision that professional snipers did not routinely achieve in daylight, and had then come down from the tower and told him calmly that the second shot had been at a moving target. I do not know, he said honestly, but I would rather have her than not. That was the end of the briefing. At 1500 hours, Reynolds went back to the terminal and tried once more to access Elena's file. This time he went in through a different pathway, not her personnel record, but the operational logs of units she might have been attached to. He filtered by her service dates, her specialty, designation, the geographic regions that the fragments of her file suggested she had operated in. He got one result. It was a unit designation he did not recognize. Iron Echo. The classification level on the unit record was high enough that he could not access the contents, but the record's existence was visible in the index, which meant it was real, and it had been active within the last decade. The associated personnel count was listed as 12. The unit status was listed as inactive. The date the unit went inactive was 5 years ago. Reynolds stared at that date. He cross-referenced it against the date of the last entry in Elena's service record before the long redacted block. They matched within 3 weeks. Something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the base's ventilation system. He tried to find Iron Echo through a lateral search after action reports. Equipment, requisitions, regional command records, anything that might illuminate what the unit had done, where it had operated, why it had gone inactive. He found exactly one external reference buried in a logistics audit from 5 years ago. 3 words in a field note from a supply coordinator who had apparently been trying to account for equipment that was requisitioned and never returned. The coordinator had written Iron Echo destroyed, not decommissioned, not reallocated, destroyed. Reynolds read that word for a long time. He thought about 12 personnel, about a unit that went inactive 5 years ago, about a service record with 7 years behind a wall, about a woman who had been sent to his base with no explanation, classified at a level above his commanding officer with a rifle that looked like junk and eyes that had seen enough to be permanently done with surprise. He thought about what it meant to be the only thing that came back from something described as destroyed. At 16:45, he climbed the tower again. Elena was in position. The late afternoon light was coming in from the southwest and hitting the ridge at an angle that created long, sharp shadows across every formation. It was excellent observation light, the kind that revealed the depth of terrain features and showed movement against contrast. She was using it. Her scope tracked in slow, deliberate arcs that covered the entire visible approach. Reynolds sat on the platform beside her without speaking for a while. He had learned in the past 24 hours that silence with Elena Cross was not an uncomfortable thing. It was a functional thing. She used it the way other people use words to fill space intentionally to set a pace to communicate something that words would have made clumsy. After several minutes, he said, Iron Echo. Her scanning did not stop, but the rhythm of it changed. The arc became a fraction shorter, the pace a fraction slower. Not much, just enough. She said nothing. I cannot access the file, Reynolds continued. I just found the unit designation in a logistics index. Personnel count of 12. Went inactive 5 years ago. He paused. The supply coordinator's note said destroyed. The silence extended. The scope continued its arc. That is what they called it, she said finally. Her voice was even, completely controlled. But underneath it, in the specific quality of the air around the words, was something that had been living in a pressurized container for a very long time. That is the accurate word. Reynolds looked at the ridge. What happened? A long pause, longer than her usual calculation pauses. This one had weight to it. A mission was compromised, she said. The unit went in on intelligence that had been given to people it should not have been given to, by someone on the inside. She adjusted the scope cant by a fraction. The team walked into a prepared position. They knew we were coming. They knew the approach route, the timing, the size of the element. Another pause. All 12 of us went in. One came back. Reynolds did not say anything. He understood that the wrong word here would close this down permanently, and that she was not telling him this because she had decided to trust him fully. She was telling him this because the information was relevant to his operational situation, and she was the kind of person who prioritized operational relevance over personal privacy when the stakes were high enough. The person who gave them the intelligence, he said. Were they ever identified? Name was connected to the investigation. The investigation was closed before it produced a conviction. Her jaw tightened by a degree, the only visible concession to what she was holding. The person was reassigned. Reassigned. Yes. Reynolds absorbed that, the specific injustice of it, the particular cruelty of a system that closes investigations and reassigns, rather than accounts he had seen versions of it before in smaller forms, in lesser stakes. What she was describing was a version with 12 bodies behind it and one survivor who had come back to a system that had then sealed her record and sent her to bases without briefings. And you kept operating, he said. There was nothing else to do. You could have gotten out. I could have. She looked through the scope. But the people who destroyed Iron Echo are still operational, and they will do it again to someone else's team if someone does not make that option less attractive. Reynolds looked at her profile. At the absolute stillness of her face and the absolute tension beneath it, coexisting the way they could only in someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had gotten so used to the weight that they had stopped noticing it consciously. Is that why you are here? He said. Ravenfall specifically. She turned her head and looked at him directly. I go where I am sent. That is not an answer. She held his gaze for a moment. No, it is not. Then she went back to the scope. Reynolds climbed down the ladder at dusk, walked back across the base, and sat at his desk without turning on the terminal. He thought about 12 people walking into a prepared position, about intelligence that had been deliberately compromised, about the investigation that went nowhere, and the reassignment that went somewhere, and about the fact that someone had then taken the one survivor of that event and sent her years later to a forward base in the middle of a conflict corridor without telling the base commander who she was or what she had survived. He thought about what it meant that she was here, at this base, at this moment with this threat moving down the supply corridor toward them. He thought about coincidences and about how often he had encountered genuine coincidences in 16 years of operational service and what the count was. The count was close to zero. At 2100 hours, the radio broke the quiet. It was a different watch corporal tonight, a young sergeant named Holloway who had the good instincts and the nervous energy of someone whose body understood threat before his brain did. His voice on the radio had the same controlled alarm quality that the previous night's watch had carried, but there was a different texture to it this time, more uncertain, more confused. Captain, North Ridge, I am looking at the thermal and I am not sure what I am seeing. Reynolds was at the radio immediately. Talk to me. Multiple contacts, but they are not moving like last night's scouts. They are spread across a wider front. I count 8 separate signatures. Reynolds felt the temperature in his chest drop several degrees. 8. At least. They might be more behind the ridge crest that the sensor cannot reach. 8 was not a scout element. 8 was a probe. A probe meant they were testing the base response, which meant the main element was watching the probe, which meant somewhere in the darkness, well beyond the sensor range, 40 to 60 personnel with vehicle-mounted weapons were waiting to see what happened to 8 scouts. Reynolds grabbed the handset. All units stand by alert. No lights, no movement, weapons at ready. Do not engage without my authorization. He was already moving toward the door. Holloway, keep the thermal running and call every movement. He crossed the yard at a run. He did not need to climb the tower to know she was already in position. The math of the situation was simple enough that she would have read it the same way he had. 8 signatures on the ridge was not a night she slept through. He stopped at the base of the ladder and looked up. Cross, her voice came down from the platform flat and steady. I see them. 8 it confirmed, possible more behind the crest. I have 11, she said. 3 are behind the crest. They are very still, waiting. Reynolds processed that. She had 11 from a platform that was not even running thermal imaging. She was reading heat signature through a scope with a night lens that was not standard equipment, or she was reading movement through the light contrast of the terrain, or she was doing something else entirely that he did not have a framework for. What are they doing? The 8 in front are probing. They want a response. They want to know if last night's scouts triggered a heightened state, or if the base is still running standard watch protocols. A pause. The 3 behind the crest are watching for the response. They will radio the main element. Reynolds pressed the handset. If we engage, we give up the elevated alert. They know we are expecting them. If we do not engage, they send the 8 forward and eventually confirm the base layout. Another pause shorter. There is a third option. He waited. Let me take the 3 behind the crest, the ones watching. The 8 in front will probe, find nothing, and report back. But without the 3 behind the crest, the report never reaches the main element. He could hear the absolute calm in her voice, the professional assessment of angles and options. The main element waits, gets no report, sends someone to find out why, buys us time. Reynolds thought through it, the angles, the timing, the consequence if it worked, and the consequence if it did not. The 3 behind the crest, can you even reach them from this platform? A silence that lasted exactly as long as she needed to run the calculation. Yes. In the dark, at what distance? The farthest one is 1,040 meters. Reynolds put one hand flat against the ladder. He steadied himself against what that number meant. That is over a kilometer. Yes, in the dark, with that rifle. The rifle, she said with the faintest inflection, is not the issue. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them. Do it. The first shot came 18 seconds later. The crack rolled across the base and disappeared into the desert dark. Holloway's voice came on the radio immediately. Contact North Ridge, behind the crest. One of the signatures just went. A pause. The sound of someone recalibrating what they are seeing. It is down. It is down. The second shot came 22 seconds after the first. Second signature, down. Then silence. 30 seconds of it. 40. Captain. Holloway's voice had the specific quality of a man watching something that he does not have language for yet. The third signature behind the crest. It started moving when the second shot came in. It went lateral, fast, trying to get off the crest. A pause that lasted 4 seconds. Sir, I have never seen a shot like that. The third crack arrived. It is down, Holloway said quietly. Reynolds held the handset and did not speak for a long moment. 1,040 meters. In the dark. At a moving target that had broken into a lateral run after hearing 2 shots. Down on the platform, the 8 scouts held position for 40 seconds. Then they began to withdraw. Not panicked, not running a professional withdrawal, the kind of movement that said they had been trained well enough to pull back in formation when the situation became unclear. They moved back up the ridge and disappeared over the crest, toward a main element that was not going to receive a radio report, toward an operation that was now running blind. Reynolds let out a breath that he had apparently been holding since the first shot. He looked up at the platform. Cross. Yes. Are you all right? A silence that had a different quality than her other silences. Not calculation, not evasion, something more personal than either of those things. I am always all right, she said. He stood at the base of the tower for a moment, listening to the desert quiet that had returned, listening to Holloway's steady updates of clear ridge, clear ridge, clear ridge over the radio. Then he said quietly so only the tower could hear it, "No, you are not." He walked back toward the command building. Behind him on the condemned tower that was not condemned in the dark that most people could not see through. Elena Cross reached up her position and went back to scanning the ridge with the patience of someone who had learned a very long time ago that the real threat was never the one that announced itself, The real threat was the one that came in the silence after. And the silence for the next hour held. But Reynolds knew the way he had known things throughout 16 years of reading operational weather, that the main element was out there in the dark. Regrouped, recalculating, counting 3 missing scouts and 1 missing radio report, and drawing the same conclusion that he had drawn from his side of the equation. Something was at FOB Ravenfall that had not been there before. Something that did not miss. And the thing about something that did not miss in Reynolds' experience was that it never stayed hidden forever. Eventually, whoever was counting bodies on the other side of the ridge was going to decide they needed to know exactly what they were dealing with, and they were going to come at it with enough force to find out. When that happened, the ridge and the tower and the quiet and the distance would all stop being advantages. And the only thing standing between FOB Ravenfall and the math of 40 to 60 armed personnel with vehicle-mounted weapons would be one woman with a rifle that looked like junk. Reynolds sat at his desk in the dark and thought about that for a very long time. Reynolds did not sleep. He sat at his desk until 0300 hours, running the same calculations in different orders and arriving at the same answer every time. The main element was out there. They had lost 5 scouts in 2 nights without a single shot fired from the base perimeter, without a flare, without a radio response, without any of the indicators that a standard forward operating base produces when it detects contact. From their position, FOB Ravenfall looked either completely unaware or completely invisible, and neither of those options made tactical sense to a professional element that had been running this quarter for weeks. That uncertainty was going to force a decision on their end, and the decision Reynolds knew was not going to be to wait longer. He was at the radio at 03:15 sending an updated threat assessment to Regional Command when Holloway's voice came through on the base channel with the specific clipped quality of someone reading a thermal display and not believing what they are seeing. "Captain, south approach, vehicle signatures." Reynolds stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. "How many?" "I count, sir, I count at least 6 vehicles, maybe more. They are coming in from the south, not the ridge." They split the element. Reynolds was already at the door. All units red alert. Weapons hot. Man every position now. The genius of it hit him as he was crossing the yard. They had spent 2 nights drawing attention to the north ridge, sending scouts creating a pattern. And while Ravenfall's attention was fixed north, the main element had looped south and was coming in from the direction nobody had been watching. It was a clean tactical reversal, the kind of maneuver that required discipline and coordination. And it told him that whoever was commanding the other side had looked at the scout losses and instead of panicking had used them to map the defensive attention of the base. He reached the base of the tower. "Cross, south approach, 6 vehicles minimum coming in from the south corridor." A 3-second silence from the platform. "Then they used the ridge to pull our eyes north." "Yes. How long have the vehicles been moving?" Holloway just called it. Another silence different from the first. He could hear her repositioning on the platform, the soft scrape of equipment against the railing, the slight shift of weight. "South approach gives them cover to the canyon mouth. If they get vehicles into the canyon before we can engage the lead element, they own the funnel." Reynolds understood. The canyon south of the base was the single worst terrain feature for the defense, deep enough to conceal vehicles wide enough for a column to advance in force and oriented directly toward the base's most vulnerable wall. If the lead vehicles reached the canyon mouth, the entire engagement changed from a distance fight to a close assault. "Can you reach the canyon mouth from your position?" he called up. The answer came back without hesitation. "Yes, but I need the lead vehicle. If I take the lead vehicle at the canyon mouth, the column behind it stacks. They cannot maneuver forward, and they cannot back up fast enough to avoid the stack." "How long to get a shot on the lead vehicle at that range?" 30 seconds from now, if they are where I think they are." Reynolds pressed the radio. "Holloway, lead vehicle on the south approach. Current position." Holloway's response was immediate. "Entering the approach corridor, now sir, estimate 90 seconds to the canyon mouth." Reynolds looked up at the tower. He could not see her in the dark, but he could feel the attention coming off the platform, the way you feel heat coming off a surface directional intense, focused on something a long way away. "Cross, you have authorization." No response. She was already working. The shot came 40 seconds later. Not the clean single crack of the ridge engagements. This was a heavier report, a deeper sound, the kind that traveled differently through canyon geography and hit the ears at an angle that made the distance hard to estimate. Then Holloway's voice, and now the man sounded genuinely unsteady. Lead vehicle is stopped. Sir, it is stopped dead at the canyon entrance. I can see the thermal shows the engine block is cold. She hit the engine block. Reynolds heard that and felt something shift in the tactical geometry of the entire engagement. She had not taken a crew shot. She had taken an engine shot at the lead vehicle, which meant the vehicle was not burning, not exploding, not creating a hazard that the column behind it could root around. It was simply stopped. A 2-ton roadblock at the only point of entry to the canyon, placed there by a single round in the dark, at a range that Reynolds had stopped trying to estimate because the estimates kept producing numbers that his experience told him were impossible. The column behind it stacked exactly as she had predicted. Holloway was calling contacts in a rapid sequence. Now the professional control in his voice fraying at the edges as the thermal display showed him 6, 7, 8 vehicles compressing behind the stopped lead unit, unable to advance, unable to reverse cleanly in the narrow approach corridor. They are bunching, Holloway said. Sir, they are completely bunched at the canyon approach. Reynolds keyed the base channel. All units south wall weapons ready. They are stacked in the corridor. Pruitt, I need first squad at the south wall in 30 seconds. Pruitt's voice came back hard and immediate. Moving. Then the second shot from the tower. This one hit something different. Reynolds heard it in the quality of the sound that followed a secondary detonation. That was not large but was distinctive. The specific crack and bang of a fuel component catching. A vehicle in the middle of the stack. Not the lead vehicle this time. The middle, which meant the column was now blocked at the front and damaged in the middle, and the vehicles at the rear were in a corridor with no room to turn around. She is picking the stack apart, Okafor said on the channel, and his voice had something in it that Reynolds had not heard from the man in 4 months. Something close to awe. She is dismantling them from the front. The enemy element responded. Reynolds heard it before Holloway called it the distinctive crack of return fire, not aimed at any specific position, but a suppressive spread across the south wall and toward the general area of the tower. They had not located her exactly. They were shooting at the muzzle flash, and the muzzle flash was coming from a platform that was dark and elevated and at an angle to the south wall that made the geometry of the return fire complicated. She did not move. She fired again. Reynolds was at the south wall with Pruitt's squad when the third shot from the tower landed, and he heard Holloway call another vehicle stop and heard the enemy return fire become more erratic, more spread, more desperate. The acoustic signature of a force that is being hurt from a direction it cannot fix and is starting to lose the discipline that keeps suppressive fire controlled. Pruitt was beside him, rifle up, watching the approach corridor, with the focus of a man who had decided in the last 48 hours to reclassify everything he thought he knew about this situation. How is she doing that from up there? He said not really to Reynolds, more to the dark. Stop asking and start watching your sector, Reynolds said. The fourth shot, then the fifth, each one finding something in the stacked column that reduced the enemy's capacity to advance, to communicate, to maneuver. After the fifth shot, the return fire from the column became sporadic, then intermittent, then largely stopped. Not because the force had been eliminated, there were still personnel in and around those vehicles, still enough guns to be deeply dangerous if they reached the south wall. But the command structure of the column was fracturing. Reynolds could hear it in the quality of the radio traffic he was intercepting on the enemy channel, the voices coming faster, overlapping, losing the call and response structure of a coordinated unit and becoming the flat, sharp exchanges of people who are not sure what is happening or where the threat is coming from. When a force loses its ability to locate a threat, it loses its ability to maneuver against it. And a force that cannot maneuver is a force that is going to make a bad decision under pressure. The bad decision came at 0422 hours. 3 vehicles broke from the rear of the stack and tried to road around the stalled column by pushing into the terrain on the east side of the approach corridor. It was the move of a unit that has lost confidence in the planned approach and is improvising, which is sometimes the right call and is very often the wrong one. In this case, it was disastrously wrong because the east side of the approach corridor was where the terrain funneled down into a shallow depression that reduced vehicle speed and eliminated lateral maneuver options. Reynolds had not planned for that. He had not needed to. Elena had positioned her platform to cover exactly that ground. 2 shots. Both vehicles stopped. The third reversed back into the corridor. Holloway on the radio had stopped narrating. He was just breathing. Reynolds keyed the command channel. Okafor, first light in approximately 90 minutes. I need eyes on the east flank by 0500. They may attempt a dismounted approach before the light comes up. Moving, Okafor said. Then Reynolds' radio produced a sound that was not any of his men. It was a voice on a channel he had not authorized for transmission, a channel that should have been secure, that should have been accessible only to base personnel and regional command. The voice was speaking in a language he did not immediately recognize, then switching to accented English, and what it said made Reynolds go completely still. Ravenfall, we know you have 1 shooter. We know the position. We are adjusting. Reynolds stared at the radio, then he keyed the command channel. Cross, they know your position. They are adjusting fire. Her response was immediate. I heard it. You need to move. A pause. Moving will cost me the angle on the east flank. Staying will cost you more than an angle. Another pause shorter. Give me 3 minutes. Cross, 3 minutes, Captain. Then the radio on the enemy channel produced the sound Reynolds had been bracing for. Since the voice announced its adjustment, the deep rhythmic thud of a mortar tube firing, and the specific whistle of an inbound round that has found an elevation and bearing. The first mortar hit 40 meters east of the tower. Reynolds was running before the impact echo cleared. He reached the base of the tower and looked up. The platform was still. She was still up there. Cross, get off that platform right now. The angle, that was a bracket round. The next one will be closer. Get off the platform. A silence of exactly 2 seconds. Then the sound of movement above him, equipment shifting, the scrape of boots on the platform surface. She was moving. Not fast, moving fast on a condemned tower ladder in the dark, with a rifle and a pack was how you became a casualty, before the enemy had to do anything but steadily the controlled descent of someone who has trained for exactly this. The second mortar round hit 20 meters west of the tower. Reynolds felt the concussion through the ground. She came off the ladder at the bottom and hit the ground beside him. Already moving, already scanning, already recalculating. East flank, as she said. They will push dismounted on the east flank while the mortar covers the tower. Where do you need to be? She was already looking. He could see her eyes moving across the base interior, the same scans she had done on the first day, reading angles and positions and coverage geometry in the time it took most people to decide which direction to look. She pointed. The north wall, second firing step from the east corner. It gives me the angle on the eastern approach and partial coverage on the south corridor. Reynolds did not question it. Move. She moved. He followed. Behind them, the third mortar round hit the base of the tower with a concussion that Reynolds felt in his teeth, and when he turned to look, the tower platform was gone. The upper section of the structure had collapsed sideways, taking the railing and the surface she had been lying on for 2 days with it. He stopped for exactly 1 second, looking at the collapsed tower, thinking about the mathematics of 3 minutes and what they had purchased. Then he kept moving. At the north wall, she was already set up. She had found the firing step, positioned herself, and had the rifle over the wall and scanning the eastern approach before Reynolds reached her position. He crouched beside her. The mortar team, he said. If they are adjusting, they have a spotter somewhere. I know where the spotter is. He stared at her. How? The radio transmission. The voice had environmental acoustics behind it. Canyon rock, not open ground. The spotter is in the rock formation east-northeast, approximately 600 meters. She adjusted the rifle. That is why they moved the dismounted element east. The spotter is guiding them in. Reynolds thought about the transmission, about the fact that someone had broadcast on a channel that should have been secure. They broke our comms channel. Yes. Which means they had intelligence about our communication protocols. She did not answer. But the specific quality of her silence, the one with weight in it, the pressurized container silence, told him that she had already arrived at the implication of that, had arrived at it some time ago, and was doing what she did with things that were too large and too sharp to be handled in the middle of an active engagement. She was putting it somewhere internal, somewhere it could be contained until there was time to deal with it properly, and she was continuing to work. Reynolds keyed the command channel. All units be advised our communication protocols may be compromised. Limit radio traffic to essential contacts only. Authentication codes on all command transmissions. Pruitt's voice came back immediately. Understood. South wall is holding. They have not pushed forward since the last vehicle went down. Keep your position. They are shifting to the east. Roger. Then Elena fired. One shot east-northeast. 600 meters into the rock formation she had identified from a radio transmission's acoustic background. Holloway's voice very quiet. Captain, the thermal just showed a signature drop in the east rock formation. I think she just took out their spotter. The mortar fire stopped. The sudden absence of the mortar rhythm was almost louder than the rounds themselves had been. The bass absorbed the silence the way a held breath gets absorbed when it is finally released with a kind of whole-body adjustment, a collective recalibration. Reynolds pressed his back against the north wall beside her. He looked at her in the early pre-dawn dark, at the absolute focus still in her face, at the way her hands were steady on the rifle without apparent effort. And he said, because the question could not wait any longer, "The communications compromise. Someone gave them our protocols." She took her eye from the scope. She turned and looked at him with the directness she reserved for things that had moved past operational into something more personal. Yes, that is not something they pick up from intercept. Not with the encryption we run. No, it is not. Which means someone with access to base communications gave them the channel information. Her voice was completely level. Someone on this base, Captain, or someone connected to this base who has been connected to it for long enough to know your protocols. Reynolds felt the cold that had moved through him earlier return, but deeper this time. More settled. The kind of cold that came not from surprise, but from confirmation, from having a suspicion that you had been carrying at a low level, suddenly given the shape of fact. He thought about Iron Echo, about intelligence that had been given to people it should not have been given to, about a mission that walked into a prepared position because someone on the inside had told them it was coming. He looked at Elena. This has happened to you before, Sism. She held his gaze. Her jaw was set, but her eyes were doing something complicated, the specific processing of a person who has been through a version of this and is now watching it replicate and is deciding in real time how much of that previous version to carry into the current one. Yes, she said, it has. Iron Echo? Yes. Reynolds looked at the north wall at the east approach at the pre-dawn dark that was beginning slowly to soften at its edges. Who on this base has access to the communication protocols? You, your watch commanders, your signals officer. A pause. And anyone who has had unsupervised access to the command building terminal in the past 72 hours. Reynolds went through the list in his head. He went through it fast, the way you go through a list when the stakes of being wrong are too high for comfort, looking for the entry that didn't sit right, the name that produced a small friction when he ran it against everything else he knew. He found two names that merited a second look. He kept both of them and said nothing to Elena, because naming a suspicion to the wrong person was how you warned the suspect. We deal with the engagement first, he said. Yes. And then we deal with the other thing. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but a change in the quality of the neutrality, a degree of openness that he had not seen before. You believe me. It was not a question. It was the statement of someone who had said versions of this to people before and had not been believed and was now recalibrating for the unexpected experience of being heard. I believe the evidence, Reynolds said, and the evidence says someone talked. He held her gaze. I also believe you, for what it is worth. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the rifle. It is worth something, she said quietly, more than you know. Dawn came in the slow way. Desert dawns arrive not suddenly but by degrees, the dark becoming less complete, then gray, then the specific gold of early light that made distances deceptive in a different way than the flat afternoon light did. With the light came clarity, and with clarity came the full picture of what the south approach looked like after a night of Elena Cross, systematically dismantling an assault column from a condemned tower. Okafor was the first one to the south wall with eyes over it in the growing light, and his voice on the radio had the quality of a man reading a damage assessment that he has run twice because he did not believe the first result. Captain, South Corridor, I count 4 vehicles immobilized. 2 appear to have partial damage to crew compartments. Personnel have withdrawn from the immediate area. A pause. Sir, they pulled back. The whole element. They are gone from the thermal. They pulled back overnight. Reynolds closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them and kept working. At 06:30, with the base in full daylight and the immediate threat assessment downgraded to elevated caution from imminent assault, Reynolds called a command meeting in the briefing room. Pruitt Okafor, his signals officer, Lieutenant Carew, and Watch Commander, Sergeant Holloway. He left 2 names off the list deliberately and noted which of those 2 names showed up at the briefing room door on some pretext or another before the meeting started. Only one of them did. A corporal named Voss, who was assigned to the signals section under Carew and had no reason to be near the briefing room at 06:30, appeared at the door with a question about a supply manifest that did not need to be answered in person at this hour, at this location. Reynolds answered it without expression, sent him away, and filed the information. The meeting itself was operational threat assessment, defensive adjustments, communication protocol, reset resource status. Carew ran the signals report and confirmed that the enemy had accessed their primary tactical channel. When Reynolds asked how Carew ran through the technical possibilities with the focused competence of a man who was genuinely trying to find the answer, and Reynolds watched him work and decided that Carew was not the vector, which left Voss. After the meeting, Reynolds went to Elena's position on the north wall firing step. She was still there. She had not moved from the position since the engagement. He crouched beside her and told her what he had observed. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Voss, how long has he been here?" Reynolds thought back. "He rotated in 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks. She looked at him. The structural assessment on the tower was 6 weeks ago. Reynolds felt that connection land. The assessment that had flagged the tower as condemned that had removed it from the base's active position inventory, that had ensured nobody would be using it for observation, an observation position that would have detected exactly what happened last night before it happened. If you had not climbed that tower on the first day, they would have had the observation on the base from the ridge without anyone in a position to see them doing it. She paused. The assessment may have been deliberately triggered, creating a reason to condemn the tower. Reynolds thought about that, about the specific deliberateness of it, about the chain of planning and patience that it implied. This is not opportunistic. This is a prepared operation. It is what Iron Echo was, she said. A prepared operation, months in the building. Someone inside providing the structure, someone outside providing the force. She looked at the East Rock Formation where the spotter had been. But Iron Echo did not have warning. This base does. Reynolds looked at her. Because of you. She said nothing. He pressed the radio. Holloway, I need Corporal Voss brought to my office, quietly. Tell him I have a question about the signals manifest. Holloway's response was careful. Yes, sir. Reynolds looked back at Elena. Whatever he tells us, the main element is still out there. They pulled back, not out. They are regrouping. They will come back with more force. They have lost too much reconnaissance to stop now. She checked the rifle. When they come back, it will not be a column. It will be a full assault. Reynolds absorbed that. A full assault on a forward operating base with 31 personnel, limited ammunition, no artillery, no air support, and a communications channel that had been compromised, against a mobile element of 40 to 60 personnel with vehicle-mounted weapons that had already demonstrated tactical sophistication. The math was not good. He looked at Elena. She was checking the rifle with the quiet thoroughness of someone who was not frightened, but who was completely clear-eyed about the nature of the situation, which was its own kind of courage, not the absence of fear, but the presence of clarity, in a place where most people would have let fear do the thinking. How long do we have? He asked. She considered the ridge, the east approach, the direction the column had withdrawn. They need to resupply the mortar element and absorb the personnel losses from last night. Integrate new information. Redesign the approach. A pause. 12 hours, maybe 18. Reynolds stood up. Then we have 12 hours to fix the hole in this base before they come back through it. He walked toward the command building. He had a corporal to question a communications protocol, to rebuild from scratch a defensive plan, to redesign with 31 people, and no reinforcements coming, and 12 to 18 hours to do all of it. The math was still not good. But the math had not been good since the moment the convoy arrived and a woman stepped out of the last truck with an old rifle and the entire base laughed. They were not laughing now. And the woman who had been the punchline of that joke had just in the space of one night dismantled an assault column, eliminated a mortar spotter from 600 meters by reading his position from a radio transmission, and identified a compromise inside the base that would have handed FOB Ravenfall to the enemy before the main assault even began. Reynolds stopped into the middle of the yard and looked back at her position on the north wall. She was back at the scope scanning patient working, doing the things she had been doing since the first afternoon with the same methodical thoroughness that had nothing to do with adrenaline or performance and everything to do with a person who had decided at some point in the years behind those classified walls that this was what she was for. Not what she wanted to be, not what she had chosen in the bright, naive way of young people choosing. What she was, what had been made of her by everything that had been done to her, and everything she had survived, and everything she had refused to let destroy her when it had every advantage in trying. Reynolds turned back toward the command building. He had 12 hours. And for the first time since the convoy arrived, he was not doing the math on 31 personnel against 40 to 60. He was doing a different kind of math. The kind that accounted for what it meant to have at the center of your defense, something the enemy had already met 3 times in the dark and had not yet correctly identified. They thought they knew what they were facing. They had adjusted their approach based on what they thought they knew. They were wrong. They had been wrong about the rifle. They had been wrong about the tower. They had been wrong about the woman. And in 12 to 18 hours, when they came back with everything they had, they were going to be wrong about all of it one final time. Reynolds went inside and started planning. Voss lasted 11 minutes. Reynolds had not gone in hard. He had not needed to. He sat across from the corporal in the command building with a single printed page, the signals log showing the timestamp of the channel breach relative to Voss's duty rotation, and he placed it on the table between them and said nothing. He let Voss look at it. He watched the specific sequence of expressions that moved across a young man's face when he realizes that the architecture of his deception has already been mapped by someone who simply needed him to confirm the last coordinate. Voss was 22 years old. He had been recruited before his deployment, Reynolds learned through a contact back home. Someone who had framed it as information sharing, as low-risk intelligence work, as something that would never get anyone killed. The specific lie that people who recruit informants always tell, because the truth that every piece of information has a body count attached to it somewhere down the chain is not a recruiting pitch that works on 22-year-olds who need money and do not yet understand the weight of consequences. He gave Reynolds everything. Names, contact methods, what he had passed, and when. The communication protocols had gone across 3 weeks ago. The tower assessment, he had not triggered it directly, but he had confirmed to his handler that the tower was the primary observation advantage of the base. And 2 weeks later, the structural assessment had been scheduled by a contractor whose authorization Reynolds traced back through 3 layers to a logistics office that had no reason to be scheduling assessments at forward operating bases. Reynolds recorded all of it. He had Voss write and sign a statement. Then he had Pruitt take Voss to secured quarters and stand on the door personally, and he told Pruitt nothing about the details because Pruitt did not need the details, and because Reynolds had learned in 3 days of watching Elena Cross that compartmentalization was not paranoia, it was operational hygiene. At 0900, he took everything Voss had given him and sent it to regional command on the rebuilt clean channel that crew had stood up by 0730. The response came back in 40 minutes. Regional Command acknowledged the intelligence compromise, confirmed that the contact name Voss had provided matched an open counterintelligence file, and informed Reynolds that additional assets were being repositioned toward his sector. The estimated arrival time for those assets was 36 hours. Reynolds read that number twice. Then he sent back a single-line estimate hostile assault in 12 to 18 hours. Additional assets will not be relevant. Regional Command did not respond to that. He found Elena at the north wall where he had left her, which was where she had been for the past 4 hours, which meant she had been in position or in transit for essentially the entire night and morning combined. He crouched beside her and gave her the summary in 40 seconds. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The handler Voss named, is it in the same chain as Iron Echo?" Reynolds had been waiting for that question. "I do not know yet. The counterintelligence file is above my access level. But the contact methodology Voss described, the recruitment approach, the layered authorization for the tower assessment, it is not improvised. It is a practiced system." She looked through the scope. It is the same system, she said. Different theater, same architecture. Her jaw tightened by the degree he had learned to read as the outer edge of what she allowed herself to show. They have been running this for years. Ravenfall is not the first. No, Reynolds agreed. Probably not. But it is going to be different from the others. She pulled back from the scope and looked at him directly, because this time they did not finish before someone noticed. Reynolds held her gaze. He understood what she meant. In Iron Echo, the operation had completed before any internal accounting could happen. The team was gone, the investigation was closed, the person responsible was reassigned. The system ate the evidence and moved on. But here with Voss in secured quarters and a signed statement in a counterintelligence file being activated at regional command. The architecture was exposed before the assault that was supposed to erase the exposure could be executed. They are going to come fast, she said. When the handler realizes Voss has been rolled up, they will push the assault timeline. They cannot afford for this base to survive and produce testimony. Reynolds had reached the same conclusion. How fast? She looked at the ridge, at the east approach, at the angles she had been calculating since dawn. They were at 12 to 18 hours before Voss was questioned. Now, she paused. They may already be moving. Reynolds was on the radio before she finished the sentence. Holloway, thermal sweep all approaches right now. Holloway's response came back in under a minute, and the quality of his voice had changed from the controlled professionalism of the morning to something wider, higher frequency, the voice of a man whose instruments are telling him something he did not expect to see this soon. Captain, east approach, I have vehicle movement, multiple signatures. And Sir North Ridge, personnel movement on the North Ridge. They are coming from two directions simultaneously. Reynolds stood up from his crouch. He looked at Elena. She was already moving, repositioning herself on the firing step to cover the east approach while maintaining partial angle on the North Ridge. Not frantic, fast, but with the economy of someone who has pre-planned every movement and is simply executing the plan. All units, Retold said on the command channel, and his voice had the flatness of a man who has moved past the stage of hope and into the stage of pure function. Full assault incoming east and north simultaneously. All positions, weapons hot, every magazine you have within arm's reach. This is not a probe. Fight accordingly. Pruitt's voice came back, and there was something in it that Reynolds had not heard from him before. Not fear, not bravado, but a stripped-down steadiness. The voice of a man who has in the past 72 hours been comprehensively recalibrated and is now operating from a more honest version of himself. First squad is set, sir. We are ready. Okafor, second squad, set. East wall weapons ready. Carew from the signals room. I have regional command on the line. They are aware of the timeline change. They are trying to redirect air assets, but the nearest platform is 40 minutes out. 40 minutes. Reynolds did not do the math out loud. He just said, keep the channel open, and went to his position on the south wall where he could see both the east approach and communicate with Elena's firing step on the north wall. The assault began at 10:47 hours. It did not begin the way the previous night's engagement had begun, incrementally, with scouts in probes and the careful testing of response. It began the way a force begins when it has run out of patience and has decided to use mass as a solution to the problem that precision had failed to solve. Vehicles came into the east approach in a column that did not stop at the canyon entrance this time, because they had learned from the previous night and had routed a dismounted element around the east flank first to suppress whatever was holding the high ground position on the north wall. Elena heard them before Holloway called them. Reynolds saw her shift her aim east and slightly south and fire twice in rapid succession, and Holloway called two dismounted personnel down on the east flank, and the suppression element that was supposed to keep her head down never completed its movement. The vehicle column pushed into the canyon anyway because they had the numbers to absorb losses and keep moving. And this time they were not stopping at the engine block shot. They were pushing through. Reynolds heard the first vehicle breach the canyon mouth and hit the south approach at a speed, and he heard Pruitt's squad open up from the south wall, and he heard the specific grinding impact of a vehicle that has taken crew fire and lost directional control at speed. Then the mortar fire began again. They had repositioned the tube overnight, found a new firing position that the East Rock Formation had concealed from Elena's angle on the north wall. The first round hit inside the perimeter, and the second hit closer, and Reynolds felt the base begin to absorb the kind of punishment that changed the geometry of everything. He was on the radio, continuously coordinating squad positions, shifting Okafor's element from the east wall to reinforce the south wall as the vehicle column pushed harder, pulling Holloway from the signals room and putting him on the north wall with a rifle, because the North Ridge personnel movement was now a full dismounted assault, and the north wall needed every weapon it could get. Elena was firing with a rhythm that Reynolds could track from his position, not the measured time shots of a sniper working at distance, but a faster cadence, the adaptation of someone who is no longer working at maximum range, but is engaging targets that are closing. Each shot produced a result that Holloway called when he could, and that Reynolds could sometimes see directly. She was not missing. She had not missed a single shot in 3 days. But there were more targets than she could service alone. The north wall took its first direct personnel breach at 11:12 hours. 2 men over the wall at the northeast corner, while her angle was committed west. Pruitt heard the breach called on the radio and pulled one of his men from the south wall, a decision that cost the south wall coverage, and gained it back on the north. And Reynolds heard the close quarters engagement on the north wall, with a specific acoustic quality of a fight inside a building, where there is no room for anything except the most immediate and violent resolution. Pruitt's man handled it, but now the south wall had a gap. Reynolds moved to fill it himself, which was not his job, but was the only available body. He was at the south wall with a rifle when the second vehicle breached the canyon and came in faster than the first. And he heard Okafor directing fire from the east wall and heard the vehicle take hits and keep coming. And then he heard Elena's rifle from the north wall firing at an angle he would not have thought possible, firing south-southeast from a north wall position. And the vehicle's windshield produced the result of a shot that had traveled across the entire interior of the base at an angle to hit a driver who should not have been in her line of sight from that position. The vehicle slewed hard left and stopped. Reynolds looked north at her position and then back at the geometry of the shot she had just made and spent exactly 2 seconds being unable to process it before the radio pulled him back. "Captain, we have a breach on the west approach. Small element, maybe 4 personnel, they came around the long way." West, they had not come from the west in any of the previous engagements. Reynolds had not resourced the west wall heavily because the terrain made a western approach slow, and the threat model had pointed north, south, and east. He had 4 personnel on the west wall. Against 4 breaching under mortar cover, that was not enough. He keyed the channel. "All available personnel to the west wall, now." The problem was that all available personnel were already committed. There were no floating reserves on a base with 31 people fighting a 3-directional assault. What he had was what was on the walls, and what was on the walls was at its limit. He heard the west wall engagement begin 3 of his 4 personnel on that wall. Rifles firing voices tight on the radio, and he was running across the base interior toward the west, when the mortar round hit close enough that the concussion knocked him sideways, and he went down on one knee and tasted copper, and came back up moving because stopping was not an option. Elena appeared beside him. Not from the north wall where he had last seen her. She had moved across the base interior during an active mortar bombardment with incoming fire from 3 walls, and appeared beside him at the center of the base with the rifle slung across her back and a sidearm in her hand. She had made a calculation he had not authorized and had not asked permission for that. The sniper position was no longer the highest value position she could occupy, and that the highest value position was wherever the base was most likely to collapse. "West wall," he said. "I know, go." They went together. He was not going to tell her to stay back because the tactical reality was that she was a more effective close quarters asset than most of the men on those walls, and the tactical reality was the only thing that mattered right now. The west wall was breaking. 2 of his 4 west wall personnel were down. Not dead, but one had taken shrapnel from the mortar hit and was out of the fight, and one had gone down in the breach engagement. The remaining 2 were holding 2 corners of a wall that needed 4, and the 4 personnel who had breached were now inside the perimeter, using the base's own structure for cover pushing toward the center. Reynolds came around the corner of the supply building and found one of them at close range and dealt with it at close range and kept moving. He heard Elena behind him not shooting because the rifle was slung and the sidearm was the tool for this distance, and he heard 2 shots from her at the speed of someone who does not need to think about the mechanics of what she is doing, who has been through this specific category of experience enough times that the thinking has been replaced by something faster and more fundamental. 2 more personnel down. The remaining 2 west wall breaches fell back toward the perimeter wall when they realized the interior was no longer unsecured, and Holloway came around the north wall corner with 2 of Pruitt's men, and the west breach was contained. Reynolds leaned against the supply building wall and breathed. He could hear the east wall still active, still taking fire from the vehicle column, and the mortar was still working, though less accurately now. The tube had shifted position, and the new firing data was not as precise. He could hear Okafor on the radio, controlled and professional, directing his squad through the east wall engagement with the quality of a man who has decided he is not going to die today and has communicated that decision to his body. He looked at Elena. She was already scanning the base interior for the next problem. There was blood on her left forearm, a surface cut from something, shrapnel or debris, not deep, but real. She had not mentioned it and did not appear to be managing it. It was simply information her body had generated and filed away as non-critical. The mortar, he said, if we do not take out the tube, they will walk it onto the fuel depot and we lose the base in a different way. I know where the new position is. She was looking at the angle of the last 2 impacts. Northeast of the original position, behind the second ridge spur. Can you reach it from inside the perimeter? She looked at the perimeter wall, at the east wall where Okafor's squad was still fully committed, at the north wall where Holloway had just reinforced, at the structure of the base interior. I need height, she said. The ridge spur is masked from ground level. The condemned tower was gone. The north wall firing step was the highest interior position, but it was below the angle she needed. Reynolds did the geometry and arrived at the same answer she had already arrived at, which was the only elevated position inside the perimeter that gave an angle over the ridge spur, the water tower. 40 feet fully exposed, no cover directly in the center of the base where every weapon system the enemy had could reach it. No, Reynolds said. She looked at him. That position is completely exposed. If they identify you up there, they will identify me immediately, she said. That is why I need to take the mortar tube first, before they can adjust. She held his gaze with the specific directness that she used when she had made a decision and was informing rather than requesting. The tube fires every 40 to 50 seconds. I need 1 shot. I can make the shot in less than 30 seconds from the time I reach the top. And if you do not take it in the first shot, I will take it in the first shot. Reynolds stared at her. He thought about Iron Echo, about 12 people and 1 coming back, about the investigation that went nowhere, and the reassignment that went somewhere, and the years of classified operations behind walls he could not read. He thought about a woman who had been through all of that and was standing in front of him offering to climb a water tower in the middle of an active assault to take 1 shot at a mortar tube because it was the move that saved the base, and she had calculated that she could do it and could not make herself not do it. You said they are going to come after this base to prevent testimony, he said. If you are on that tower and they bring everything onto you, then they are not bringing it onto the walls, she said, and your men hold the walls. He looked at her for a long moment. In that moment, something passed between them that was not tactical, something that had no place in an operational briefing and no language in a military context, but was as real as the mortar rounds hitting the base. He understood that she was not offering this the way a soldier offers a calculated risk. She was offering it the way a person offers the thing they have decided they are willing to pay, because the alternative is something she would not be able to carry. She had watched a team die because of a compromised mission, had come back alone, had spent years in the operational space between those 2 facts. She was not going to watch 31 people die in the same architecture if her body between the threat and the outcome could change the math. Go, he said. She went. He watched her cross the base interior at a run, watched her hit the water tower access ladder and begin climbing with the controlled speed of someone who has made peace with the exposure before the first rung. He keyed the command channel. All units, Cross is on the water tower. She is taking the mortar. The moment she fires, I need every weapon system on the northeast ridge spur. Everything we have, cover her position. Pruitt's voice came back, and there was something in it that Reynolds would remember for a long time after. Something that had no performance left in it at all, just a man at his most stripped down and honest. We have her, sir. She reached the top of the water tower at 11:34 hours. Reynolds could see her from the base center exposed against the sky, prone across the top of the tank rifle, extended toward the northeast. He was counting seconds. The mortar tube was on a 40 to 50-second cycle. She had climbed in 22 seconds. He had perhaps 20 seconds before the next round was loaded and fired. She fired at 17. The shot went northeast over the ridge spur at a distance Reynolds could not estimate from his position. He heard the round travel, and then he heard something that was not a mortar firing. He heard a secondary sound, the specific acoustic signature of a disrupted firing mechanism of a tube and a crew that had been met with a round they had not planned for. Holloway's voice on the radio, mortar signature on thermal, "It is down. Sir, the tube is down. I am not seeing any more firing data from that position." Then the enemy responded to the water tower. It came from 3 directions, simultaneously. Small arms from the east wall, a vehicle-mounted weapon from the south approach that had been held back until this moment, and personnel fire from the north ridge that had advanced close enough during the west wall engagement to have angle on the interior. Reynolds heard it all converge on the water tower at the same moment, and he was shouting into the radio before the first impacts registered, calling every weapon system on the base to the positions she had told him to cover, and Pruitt was already moving his squad to the south wall, and Okafor was shifting east, and Holloway had his team on the north wall, and for approximately 90 seconds, F.O. Bravenfall fired everything it had in every direction. The water tower took 3 direct hits. The structure failed on the third. Reynolds heard it in the metal, the specific groan of load-bearing material that has reached its limit, the short, loud crack of a joint giving way, and then the upper section came down in a controlled collapse that was not slow and was not quiet, and hit the base interior with a concussion that Reynolds felt in his sternum from 30 meters away. He was running before it hit the ground. The dust was still settling when he reached the wreckage. He heard his own voice on the radio, heard himself calling for medical, heard Pruitt's squad moving on the south wall behind him, finishing the engagement that had been directed at the tower, heard Okafor's voice saying, "East vehicles are withdrawing. East vehicles. They're withdrawing," heard the specific silence that follows a sustained fire engagement when one side has decided it has had enough. He pulled wreckage with his hands. Carew appeared beside him and pulled with him. Holloway arrived, and the 3 of them worked the debris until Carew said, "Here, she is here." She was alive. She had gone off the tower with the rifle still in her hands, which told Reynolds everything he needed to know about her instincts and her training and the specific category of person she was, and she had landed in the partial shelter of the tank section as it collapsed, which had distributed the impact in a way that was survivable. She was conscious when they reached her. Barely. Her left side had taken the worst of it. He could see, from the way she was holding it, that something was broken, ribs at minimum, possibly more. There was a cut on her forehead, producing the kind of blood that looked dramatic and was usually superficial. Her eyes were open and tracking. She looked up at Reynolds when he got to her. "The tube," she said. Her voice was compressed by the rib damage, but audible. "Down to it," he said. "You got it." She processed that. Her eyes closed for a moment. Not unconsciousness, he could see her, still working, still running calculations behind closed eyelids, still being the person she could not stop being, even in the wreckage. Then they opened again. "The east vehicles," she said, "withdrawing," Okafor confirmed. "North Ridge? Pulling back, all approaches." He looked down at her. "The assault is broken. They are retreating." She lay still for a moment with that information. Around them, the base was transitioning from the flat total noise of sustained combat to the specific sounds of aftermath commands being called men, moving the radio traffic of a force that has survived something and is accounting for itself. Reynolds heard Pruitt's voice doing a personnel check, heard the numbers coming back, heard them come back at 30. 30 out of 31 with Voss in secured quarters. He heard that number and felt something release in his chest that had been locked since the moment Holloway called the assault incoming. He looked at Elena. She was watching him. 30, he said, all of them. Something moved in her face, not the controlled neutrality she used for everything. Something underneath that, something older and more personal. Something that lived in the space between the woman who had come back alone from Iron Echo and the woman lying here in the wreckage of a water tower, having just pulled 30 people through an assault that was designed to erase them the same way her team had been erased. Her hand found his arm. Not a grip, just a contact. The lightest possible version of a person acknowledging that they are not alone in a moment. All of them, she said quietly. Reynolds covered her hand with his and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. Around them, F.O. Ravenfall breathed, broken, battered, standing. The enemy was in retreat. The base had held. And the mortar was down, and the 30 were accounted for. And somewhere in the northeast ridge, the wreckage of a fire tube was cooling in the desert heat ended by a single round from a rifle that everyone had laughed at on the first day. Crew crouched beside them. Medevac is 40 minutes out. Regional command confirmed. He paused. They are also sending, sir, they are sending an investigative team for the Voss situation. And for, he stopped, looked at Elena, looked back at Reynolds. For the Iron Echo file, they are opening it. Reynolds looked at him. The full file. Yes, sir. They said circumstances have produced new evidence that the original investigation closure was improper. Carew chose his next words carefully, the way a young officer chooses words when he understands he is on the edge of something significant. They said someone in the chain requested it be reopened. Today, from this base's command. Reynolds had sent that request that morning buried in the intelligence package he had forwarded with Voss's statement. He had not told Elena. He looked at her now. She was looking at him with an expression that he could not immediately categorize because he had not seen it on her face before. It was not neutrality. It was not the controlled professional distance she used for the world. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for 5 years and has just had someone reach out and take part of the weight without being asked. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Reynolds stayed beside her in the wreckage of the water tower, while the base settled around them and the medevac was 40 minutes out, and the desert held the silence of a fight that had finished. And he thought about Iron Echo, and about the 12 names behind that wall in her file, and about the fact that this morning those names had been closer to justice than they had been in 5 years. Not there yet, not resolved, not the accountability that she deserved and they deserved, but closer. And for the first time in 3 days since a convoy arrived under a heat shimmer, and everyone laughed, Reynolds allowed himself to believe that the distance between where they were and where this needed to end was something that could be crossed. He stayed beside her until the medevac came. The medevac landed 43 minutes after Carew made the call, and in those 43 minutes, Reynolds did not move from Elena's side. He had field-dressed the cut on her forehead, confirmed that her breathing, though compressed and clearly painful, was moving air, without the wet sound that indicated a punctured lung, and had kept her talking because keeping her talking was the only tool he had that cost him nothing and might cost him everything if he stopped. She was not easy to keep talking. She answered his questions with the minimum words required and spent the intervals between doing what she always did, processing, scanning, calculating, except that now she was doing it flat on her back in the wreckage of a water tower with 3 broken ribs and a head wound, in the specific expression of someone who finds enforced stillness more uncomfortable than pain. Tell me something that is not a status report, Reynolds said at the 20-minute mark. She looked at him. What? You keep giving me your own medical assessment. I have eyes. Tell me something else. A silence. She looked at the sky above the base. There were 11 of them, she said, in Iron Echo, 11 besides me. A pause that had the weight of something she had carried a long time and almost never set down. Their names are in the file, all 11. When the investigation was closed, the file was sealed with the names inside, like they never existed. Reynolds said nothing. He let her have the space. Marcus Webb was the best shot I ever saw before. She stopped, started again. He could read wind at distance the way other people read faces. He knew what the air was doing before the instruments did. She paused. He was 29. Reynolds stayed still. Diane Cho was our medic. She used to argue with everyone about everything, doctrine, tactics, gear choices, the right way to lace boots. She had an opinion about everything, and she was right about most of it. The compressed breathing, the controlled pain. She was 26. She named 3 more before the medevac noise killed the conversation, and Reynolds memorized every name she gave him because he understood without being told that this was not something she did, and the fact that she was doing it now here with him was not a small thing. It was the specific act of a person who has been keeping something sealed because they could not trust the container to hold it, And who has found in the wreckage of a water tower at the end of a 3-day battle? One person they trust with the weight of it. The medevac team took her efficiently and without drama. Before they loaded her, she caught Reynolds' wrist with her right hand, the uninjured side, and held it with a grip that was considerably stronger than someone with 3 broken ribs had any right to produce. "The investigation," she said. "It is open." Carew confirmed. "It has been opened before. It gets closed." Reynolds looked at her. Not this time. Voss's statement connects the handler to the authorization chain for the tower assessment, which connects to the communications compromise, which connects to the assault. That is not a classified operations file that can be sealed. That is a criminal case with physical evidence and 30 living witnesses. She held his wrist for a moment longer. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was running the full calculation, taking all available information and testing it against every failure mode she could identify. He could see her finding the holes, testing the seams, checking for the place where this would come apart the way things had come apart before. Whatever she found, it was apparently different from the previous times. She released his wrist. She let them load her. The medevac lifted and Reynolds watched it go, and then he turned back to his base and started accounting for the damage. The accounting took most of the day. FOB Ravenfall had taken structural damage to the south wall, the west perimeter, and the interior from mortar impacts. The water tower was a total loss. The condemned observation tower, which had already been classified as a loss before the battle, had been further reduced to a base section and a debris field. 3 of his personnel had injuries requiring medical attention beyond field treatment. None were critical. 30 had come through a sustained 3-directional assault with vehicle-mounted weapons and mortar support and had come through it with nobody dead. Reynolds sat with that number for a long time that evening. 30. Every one of them. He wrote the after-action report that night. He wrote it with the specific care of a man who understands that some documents outlast the events they describe, and that the events he was describing, 3 nights of ridge engagements, the assault, the water tower, they needed to be on record in language precise enough that no one with access to a classification stamp could make the precision disappear. He wrote Elena's operational contributions in the kind of specific, measurable detail that made redaction difficult. He named distances, he named conditions, he named the sequence of the mortar engagement and the geometry of the water tower shot. He named the moment she had climbed down from a sniper platform to fight close quarters through the west wall breach because the base needed her there and she had known it before he did. He submitted it at 2300 hours. He sent copies to 3 separate command addresses, which was one more than protocol required. The investigative team arrived the following morning. 2 officers from the Counterintelligence Division, a JAG representative, and a civilian who identified himself as attached to an oversight committee that Reynolds had heard of but never interacted with. They were professional, thorough, and clearly operating under a different level of urgency than counterintelligence teams usually brought to forward base postings. Voss was transferred to their custody within 2 hours of their arrival. The civilian asked Reynolds 3 questions about the Iron Echo file, listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who already knew most of what he was saying and was confirming rather than learning, and then said something that Reynolds was not expecting. The original investigation closure was not a procedural failure, the civilian said. It was deliberate. We have known that for approximately 18 months. We did not have the evidentiary thread to move on the responsible party until now. He looked at Reynolds with the specific expression of a man who is saying something in the room that he would not say on any recording. What happened at this base in the past 72 hours gave us that thread. Reynolds stared at him. You knew the closure was deliberate for 18 months. Yes. And Iron Echo's file stayed sealed. Yes. Reynolds felt something hot move through him that he did not fully suppress and did not fully express. He said in a voice that was carefully level, "There are 11 names in that file." The civilian held his gaze. I know. They deserve better than 18 months. Yes, the civilian said, they do. He did not look away. So does the person who came back from what happened to them and who has spent the years since in operational postings that have been, let us say, selectively managed to keep her available for use while keeping her file inaccessible. Reynolds went very still. Selectively managed. She has been posted to difficult sectors consistently since Iron Echo. Sectors where the operational risk was high enough that a casualty would not produce unusual scrutiny. The civilian's voice was flat and factual, the voice of someone delivering an ugly thing in the plainest possible terms. She was not supposed to survive the postings. That was the intent. Keeping her operational made her a legitimate casualty risk rather than a loose end that needed to be actively managed. Reynolds sat with that for the length of time it took him to run through all of the implications and arrive at the one that sat at the center. Then sending her here was intended to be her last posting? Yes. The assault was not incidental, it was arranged. The same handler who ran Voss has been connected to 3 previous postings where she was assigned. The civilian closed the folder in front of him. She was not sent to Ravenfall. She was sent at Ravenfall. Reynolds stood up. He did not do anything with the standing. He was not going to put his hands on a civilian investigator, and he was not going to walk out of his own briefing room, but he needed to be vertical with what he had just heard because sitting down with it was not possible. He stood and breathed and looked at the wall. She had known. Some part of her had known or had suspected enough that the knowledge lived in the back of everything she did. The careful operational mind that read bases in 45 seconds and located mortar spotters by radio acoustics had surely run the calculation on her own posting. History had surely noticed the pattern of high-risk assignments, had surely asked herself at some point why the file stayed sealed and the investigation stayed closed, and she kept being sent to places where the math of survival was not in her favor. She had known, and she had gone anyway, and she had climbed the condemned tower on the first day not because she was following orders, but because she was refusing in the most fundamental way available to her to be the casualty this posting was designed to produce. He sat back down. What happens now? The responsible party is being taken into custody today. The Iron Echo file will be fully declassified within 30 days. The 11 personnel will be formally recognized. The civilian paused, and Cross will be offered a full medical and operational review with the option to separate from service with a record that reflects her actual contributions rather than the version that has been managed. Reynolds looked at him. Or she can stay in, with a file that is no longer sealed, with the recognition she has earned. He paused again. Those will be her choices to make, not anyone else's. Reynolds thought about what she had said on the water tower, about how she had climbed it knowing they would see her, knowing they would bring everything under that position, and had done it anyway, because the alternative was letting the base absorb what she could absorb instead. He thought about the list of names she had given him in the wreckage Marcus Webb Diane Cho. 3 more said in the voice of someone who has been the only keeper of those names for 5 years and is finally, provisionally testing whether the world is ready to share the weight. She is going to want to know about the recognition, Reynolds said, for Iron Echo. That matters more to her than anything about her own record. The civilian nodded once. I know. Reynolds spent the next 3 days running a base that was holding itself together with field repairs in the specific cohesion of people who have been through something together and come out the other side. The south wall was shored up with materials cannibalized from the condemned tower debris. The communication system was rebuilt clean from the hardware level up crew working 20-hour days to have it operational before the investigative team needed the channel. The 3 injured personnel were evacuated to the regional medical facility and were by all reports going to be returned to duty within weeks. Pruitt came to Reynolds' office on the 2nd day. He knocked on the door frame and waited to be invited in, which was not something he had done in the previous 4 months. Reynolds waved him to a chair. Pruitt sat down and was quiet for a moment, which was also not something he had done in the previous 4 months. He had the look of a man who has been processing something for 48 hours and has arrived at a point where the processing needs to become words or it is going to stay unfinished. I have been thinking about the first day, Pruitt said. Reynolds waited. The yard, the rifle, what I said. He looked at his hands. What I did. Yes. I want to go see her at the medical facility. He looked up. If she will see me. Reynolds considered him. Considered the specific transformation that had occurred in this man over 72 hours, the stripping away of performance and assumption, and the emergence of something more honest and less comfortable. I cannot speak for what she will or will not do, he said, but I think you should go. Pruitt nodded. He started to stand. Then he stopped. She told me the rifle is supposed to look like junk, he said. That day in the yard, she said she was supposed to look like what the rifle looked like. He paused. I have been thinking about that, about how fast I decided what I was looking at, about how easy it was. He stood up. I do not want it to be that easy again. Reynolds looked at him. Then make sure it is not. Pruitt left. Reynolds went back to his papers. On the fourth day, he drove the 2 hours to the regional medical facility himself. She was in a standard ward sitting upright in the bed with the ribs taped and the forehead cut closed with 6 stitches. And the rifle across her lap, the nurses had apparently tried twice to move it and had been met with the specific quality of Elena Cross's attention that convinced people not to try a third time. She was reading a printed document when he came in. She looked up, registered him, and set the document face down on the bed with the practiced neutrality of someone who does not want to discuss what they were reading. Reynolds sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which was the most natural thing in the world, because they had established over the previous days that silence between them was not absence. It was its own language. The investigative team briefed you, he said, yesterday. All of it. All of it. Her voice was even. The ribs made her breathe carefully, each word measured against the cost of air. The arranged postings, the intent. A pause. I had the outline of it, not the specific confirmation. How long had you had the outline? She looked at the window. 2 years, maybe a little more. There was a pattern in the posting assignments that did not match any legitimate operational logic I could identify. She paused. I kept going anyway. Why? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, because stopping meant they won, and stopping meant the 11 names stayed in a sealed file. And stopping meant that whatever they built, the system, the handler network, the architecture of compromising operations from inside kept running without anyone who knew what it looked like being close enough to do anything about it. Reynolds looked at her. You were using yourself as bait. She turned from the window and met his eyes. I was using myself as a witness, a moving witness, so they could not fix my position. The faintest compression at the corner of her mouth. A witness they kept trying to eliminate and kept failing to eliminate, which meant they kept exposing more of their network in each attempt. She paused. Ravenfall was the 4th attempt. Each one gave me more information. This one gave the investigation enough. Reynolds sat with that. He sat with the full weight of it, not just the tactical intelligence of it, not just the operational discipline it required, but the human cost of it. 2 years of deliberate exposure, of going to postings that were designed to kill her and coming back from each one with more information and less certainty about how many more she had in her, of carrying 11 names in a sealed file, and the specific aloneness of being the only one who knew the full shape of what she was doing. You could have brought this to someone, he said. Counterintelligence. I chased someone. I tried twice. The first time the report disappeared. The second time the officer I reported to was transferred within a week. She held his gaze steadily. The architecture goes deep, Captain. You cannot report to a system from inside the system when the system is what you are reporting on. You need evidence that is too large and too specific and too publicly connected to be made to disappear. Ravenfall is that evidence. Reynolds leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. He thought about the first day, about a convoy arriving and a woman stepping out of a truck with a torn hood and an old rifle and everyone laughing, about how he had seen something different in her eyes and had not been able to name it. He understood now what he had seen. He had seen someone who was executing a plan that nobody else knew existed in a place that had been selected to end her, with the absolute clarity of a person who has decided that the thing they are doing is worth what it costs. He looked back up at her. The civilian from the Oversight Committee. He said you will be offered choices. Medical review, separation, updated record. He paused. Or you can stay in. She said nothing immediately. She looked at the rifle across her lap. Her hand moved to it, not gripping it, just resting against it, the way you rest against something that has been yours for long enough to feel like a part of the body. Iron Echo is going to be formally recognized, Reynolds said. All 11, the file declassified. Full posthumous honors. He watched her face. It is happening. It is not a possibility. It is done. Something moved through her face. He had seen every expression she was capable of over the past 72 hours, had cataloged them because she gave so few, and each one carried weight. This one was different from all of them. It started somewhere behind her eyes and moved outward, and it was not composed, and it was not neutral, and it was not the controlled professional distance she used for the world. It was what lived underneath all of that. The thing that had been waiting behind the sealed walls of a file for 5 years, waiting for the world to be ready to acknowledge what it owed to 11 people who went into a prepared position because someone inside sold them out and came back as 11 names in a file that nobody was supposed to open. She did not cry. She was not someone who cried easily. Reynolds suspected, or perhaps at all. But the thing that moved through her face was large enough that it needed a moment to move through, and he sat quietly and let it. When it passed, she looked at him. Her eyes were clear. Her jaw was set. She was herself again, the version of herself that functioned, that calculated, that moved through the world with the precision of something that has been through the fire and come out the other side, not soft but not brittle either. Something harder and more honest than either. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Reynolds was surprised by the question. Not because it was an unusual question, it was a reasonable thing to ask someone who had been beside you through something, but because Elena Cross was not a person who asked that kind of question. She asked tactical questions. She asked operational questions. She asked questions that had specific, calculable answers. This question was different. This question was a question of someone who is standing at a genuine crossroads and who trusts the person they are asking. He thought about it seriously. He thought about what she had already given and what had been taken, and what the cost of 2 more years of deliberate exposure would be, and what happened to very capable people when the thing that had been driving them was finally resolved and they had to find out what was underneath. "I think," he said carefully, "that you have been a weapon for a long time, and weapons are necessary. But a weapon is not the only thing a person can be." He held her gaze. "You know things that nobody else knows, about how teams are compromised, about how the architecture of a leak works from the inside, about what the indicators look like, and what the response costs. There are people going through training right now who are going to walk into the same situation Iron Echo walked into, and they do not know what you know." She was very still. "You could teach them," he said, "not just the shooting, the rest of it. The part that keeps teams alive when the intelligence has been touched." He paused. "That is not a lesser thing than what you have been doing. It might be a larger thing." The silence extended. She looked at the rifle. She looked at the window. She looked at the printed document she had set face down on the bed, and he understood suddenly that the document was the list, the 11 names from the Iron Echo file printed and physical, finally out from behind the classification wall, and in her hands for the first time. She had been reading their names when he walked in. She turned back to him. She looked at him with a directness she reserved for things that had moved past operational into the territory of what was actually true. "I do not know how to stop," she said. "I have been moving for 5 years. I do not know what I am if I stop." Reynolds looked at her. "You are the person who taught 30 Marines at FOB Ravenfall what it looks like when someone does not miss," he said. "You are the person who took a rifle that everyone laughed at and used it to dismantle an assault column, take out a mortar team at distance, and hold a base with 30 personnel against a force 3 times their size." He leaned forward. "You are the person who carries 11 names and has been carrying them alone for 5 years, and who just got the back onto the world. You do not have to know what comes next the moment the last thing finishes. You are allowed to find out." Pruitt came the next morning. Reynolds knew because Pruitt had called ahead and asked him to not for permission, but because he wanted Reynolds to know he had done it, which was another thing that the previous Pruitt would not have done. Reynolds did not go with him. He did not need to be in that room. What happened in that room was between 2 people and did not require a witness. What he heard afterward from Pruitt in the parking area outside the facility, standing beside his vehicle with his arms at his sides and his face doing the honest thing it had learned to do in the past week, was that she had seen him, that she had let him sit down, that he had said what he came to say, and that she had listened without making it easy for him, but without making it impossible either. That she had said at the end of it that the rifle was still not junk. And that she had said it with the compression at the corner of her mouth that was her version of something warmer than she usually allowed. Pruitt stood in the parking area and said, "I did not understand what I was looking at." He said it the way a man says something he has been working toward for a week, the final version of something that started as a specific discomfort of being wrong and became through the process of everything that had happened since the foundation of a different way of moving through the world. I looked at the surface and decided I knew the whole thing. I was not looking at a rifle. I was not looking at a worn jacket. I was looking at someone who had been through more than I am going to go through in my entire career. And I laughed at her. Reynolds said nothing. He let Pruitt have the fullness of what he was working through. I am not going to do that again. And then Pruitt said, whatever I do for the rest of the time I am in this job, I am not going to do that again. Reynolds looked at him. Good, he said. Make sure you mean it. I mean it. Reynolds believed him. The formal recognition ceremony for Iron Echo took place 6 weeks later in a location Reynolds was not cleared to attend, but received a full account of through channels that Carew had helped him build in the aftermath of the investigation. 11 names, full posthumous honors, families notified, some for the first time, of the true nature of what their people had done and how they had died. The sealed file opened, the record corrected. The individual responsible for the original compromise, the one who had sold 12 people into a prepared position, who had closed an investigation, who had arranged postings designed to eliminate the one witness who had survived, was in custody, and the case against them was the kind of case that the complexity of the system could not make disappear. Too many witnesses, too much physical evidence, too many connections between Ravenfall and the Iron Echo operation, documented in a record that Reynolds had written with the specific care of a man who understood that some documents outlast the events they describe. Elena sent him a message the day before the ceremony. 3 sentences. She had accepted a new assignment. Not a combat posting, a training command, a newly established program for advanced operational security and team integrity, specifically designed to address the category of threat that had destroyed Iron Echo. The program did not have a name yet. She was going to name it herself. Reynolds read the 3 sentences twice. Then he sat at his desk and thought about a condemned tower and a woman who climbed it because it was the best position available, and she was not going to let the available positions be defined by someone else's assessment of what was usable. He thought about 11 names said quietly in the wreckage of a water tower to the only person present. He thought about a rifle that looked like junk and was not. He wrote back 2 sentences. He told her he was glad she was staying. He told her Marcus Webb and Diane Cho and all 9 others would have been glad too. She did not respond to that. She did not need to. Some things were too large for a response and too true to require one. The program she built over the next 2 years trained more than 300 personnel in the specific disciplines that kept teams alive when the intelligence had been compromised from inside. How to read the indicators, how to protect communication architecture, how to recognize the pattern of a prepared position before you walked into it. The curriculum was built from her own experience, from 11 sets of lessons paid for in the highest possible currency, converted into doctrine that went into classrooms and field exercises and operational briefings at every level of the chain she had once moved through alone. The graduates of the program knew her name. Most of them knew parts of the story, the base, the ridge, the water tower, the rifle. Some of them knew more than parts. Some of them knew enough to understand that the doctrine they were being given had not been assembled in a classroom, that it had been assembled in the field under fire by a person who had paid for every line of it personally. Some of them asked her in the quiet, after the formal instruction, what it had been like. She gave different answers at different times in the honest way of someone who was still working through a thing even while they are teaching it. But the answer she gave most often to the ones who asked the most direct version of the question was short. She told them that the hardest thing she had ever done was not the tower. It was not the shots in the dark. It was not the 3-directional assault or the mortar or the water tower collapsing with her on it. The hardest thing was trusting that staying was worth more than disappearing again. And then she told them that the moment she understood that everything else became manageable, she told them that without flinching, without the compression at the corner of the mouth that was her version of distance. Directly, clearly, the way she said things when they were simply true and did not need to be protected, because they were simply true, and she had stopped protecting them. The rifle hung on this wall of the training room, not as decoration, not as a trophy, as a reference point, the thing she pointed to when she needed to explain in the quickest possible terms what the program was about and what it was for. She would tell them a rifle that looks like junk is the most dangerous weapon in the room, because everyone has already decided they know what it is. The moment you think you know what you are looking at, you have stopped looking. And the moment you stop looking is the moment you are most exposed. She would tell them, look longer, assume less, and never ever decide you know the full cost of a thing by its surface. 300 personnel over 2 years heard that lesson from the person who had earned the right to teach it, and not one of them forgot it, because some lessons are only given once by the only person alive who could have given them in a voice that carries the specific authority of someone who has been through the fire and chosen at the end of it not to disappear, but to stay and make sure the fire means something. Elena Cross stayed, and because she stayed, others came home.